The ice groans. It is not the sound of wind or waves, but something far more terrifying, the voice of a living thing. Deep beneath the hull of the Endurance, the Antarctic pack ice tightens its grip, pressing against the wooden planks with a force that could crush steel. The ship shudders. Men freeze mid-step, tools suspended in their hands, breath visible in the sub-zero air. They listen. It is October 27, 1915. 28 men are trapped in the most remote place on Earth. Their vessel held captive by an ocean that has turned to stone. The temperature hovers at 40 degrees below zero. The nearest land are frozen, uninhabited Rockleys hundreds of miles away. No wireless radio. No possibility of rescue. No one even knows they are dying here. The ice groans again, louder this time, a sound like cannon fire. Commander Ernest Shackleton stands on the tilting deck, his jaw clenched, watching his ship, his carefully chosen vessel, his instrument of glory, being slowly murdered by the Antarctic winter. How did they come to this? What series of decisions led 28 souls into this frozen prison? And when the ice finally wins, how will any of them survive? Ernest Henry Shackleton was 40 years old in the summer of 1914, and he was desperate, not for money, though he had little, not for fame, though he craved it. He was desperate for redemption. Born in Ireland but raised in England, Shackleton had spent 2 decades chasing Antarctic glory. In 1909, he had come within 97 nautical miles of the South Pole before starvation forced him back. The failure haunted him. Then, in December 1911, Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen planted his flag at the pole. 5 weeks later, British Captain Robert Falcon Scott arrived at the same spot, only to discover he'd been beaten. Scott and his entire party perished on the return journey, becoming tragic heroes. Shackleton watched from England as the world mourned Scott and celebrated Amundsen. There was nothing left for him at the pole. It had been conquered. The race was over. But Shackleton possessed something his rivals lacked, an almost supernatural ability to reimagine defeat as opportunity. If the pole was taken, he would do something even more audacious. He would cross the entire Antarctic continent on foot, 1800 miles from sea to sea, through the most hostile environment on Earth. No one had ever attempted it. Most thought it impossible. He called it the Imperial Transantarctic Expedition. The plan was bold to the point of madness. Land on one side of the continent with one team, land on the opposite side with a support team, and march through the heart of Antarctica to meet in the middle. It would take 2 years. It would require perfect coordination between 2 ships separated by thousands of miles of ice. It would demand superhuman endurance from every man involved. Shackleton needed funding, a ship, and a crew. He secured £10,000 from the British government and private donors, barely enough. For the ship, he purchased a Norwegian vessel built specifically for polar conditions, 3-masted, 144 feet long, with a hull designed to withstand ice pressure. He named her Endurance after his family motto, "By endurance we conquer." Then he placed an advertisement in London newspapers. Men wanted for hazardous journey. Small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return, doubtful, honor and recognition in case of success. Over 5,000 men applied. Shackleton selected his crew with meticulous care. He chose Frank Wild as his second in command, a veteran of 2 previous Antarctic expeditions. Tough, loyal, unshakable, Frank Worsley would serve as captain of the Endurance, a New Zealander with an almost mystical ability to navigate by dead reckoning. Tom Crean, an Irish seaman built like an oak tree, served as second officer. Australian photographer Frank Hurley would document everything with his camera and film equipment. There was a Scottish biologist and Irish stowaway who talked his way into staying. 2 surgeons, engineers, carpenters, and 20 ordinary seamen, most in their 20s. Hungry for adventure, unaware of what awaited them. They sailed from London on August 1, 1914, and the very same day, Germany invaded Belgium. By the time Endurance reached Buenos Aires in October, the Great War had engulfed Europe. Shackleton sent a telegram to the Admiralty offering to place ship and crew at the service of the war effort. First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, replied with a single word: proceed. They departed from South Georgia Island, the last outpost of civilization, on December 5, 1914. The whalers in the harbor warned Shackleton that the ice conditions were the worst they'd seen in memory. The Antarctic pack ice had advanced further north than usual. Shackleton thanked them for their concern and gave the order to sail. Within days, they encountered the ice. Not the familiar icebergs of polar waters, but something far more ominous. A vast, shifting field of pack ice extending to every horizon. Worsley maneuvered Endurance through narrow channels called leads, searching for openings, dodging ice floes the size of city blocks. For weeks they pushed southward, making progress, retreating, finding new routes. The men remained optimistic. Shackleton had done this before. They would break through. They didn't know it yet, but the Weddell Sea was closing around them like a trap. Chapter 1. Captured on January 18th, 1915. Just 70 miles from their intended landing point on the Antarctic coast, the ice stopped moving. Endurance sat frozen in place, locked in a field of pack ice that stretched unbroken in every direction. Worsley climbed to the crow's nest with his binoculars and scanned the horizon. Nothing but white. No water, no leads. The ship had become part of the ice itself. Shackleton ordered the engines shut down to conserve coal. The silence that followed was profound. No engine rumble, no wave slap against the hull, just wind and the occasional crack of ice adjusting its grip. The men waited for the ice to break up. Summer was approaching. Surely the pack would loosen. They were patient. They'd been at sea for months. A few more weeks wouldn't matter. But the weeks passed, and the ice only thickened. The Endurance was not simply stuck, she was a prisoner, drifting at the mercy of ocean currents beneath the frozen surface. Each day the ship moved, but not under her own power. The ice carried her north, then west, then south again, tracing a chaotic path through the Weddell Sea. They were helpless passengers on a frozen ocean. Shackleton kept the crew busy. Routines were established. The scientists conducted experiments. The crew played soccer on the ice. Hurley set up his darkroom and developed photographs. The ship's cat, Mrs. Chippy, prowled the deck. They celebrated birthdays and holidays with elaborate meals prepared by the cook. Morale remained surprisingly high. These were professional explorers and seamen. They understood that polar expeditions involved setbacks. Shackleton projected absolute confidence. Everything would be fine. But beneath the optimism, a dark reality was settling in. They were trapped, with no means of communication. And no one was coming to help them. Chapter 2. The crush begins as autumn approached in April 1915. The Antarctic sun began its long descent toward winter. The temperature dropped to 30, then 40, then 50 degrees below zero. The ice thickened to depths of 10, 15, 20 feet, and then it began to move. Pack ice is not static. It is a living, breathing entity, pushed by currents and wind expanding and contracting with temperature changes. When vast sheets of ice collide, the pressure is unimaginable. Ice flows the size of football fields buckle upward, creating ridges 30 feet high. Other sections are crushed to powder, and anything caught between the moving plates is slowly, inexorably destroyed. In May, the men began to hear the groaning. It started as a low rumble, like distant thunder. Then it grew louder, closer. The ice around Endurance was being compressed. The floes were grinding together, pushing against the hull. The ship's timbers creaked in protest. At night, the sounds were worse. Men lay in their bunks listening to the symphony of destruction. Groans, snaps, crashes, the scream of wood under impossible strain. Shackleton remained calm. The Endurance had been built for this. Her hull was designed to be pushed upward by ice pressure, to ride the compression rather than resist it. She would survive. She had to. But the worst was yet to come. Chapter 3. Darkness and desperation. By June, the Antarctic night had arrived for months of perpetual darkness. The sun vanished below the horizon and did not return. The men lived by lamplight in the ship's cramped quarters. 28 souls packed into a space meant for comfort, now feeling like a coffin. The temperature outside reached 60 below zero. Exposed skin would freeze in seconds. The darkness was not merely an absence of light, it was a presence, a weight that pressed down on the mind. Tempers began to fray. Small irritations became arguments. The cramped conditions, the monotony, the constant cold, all of it wore on the nerves. Shackleton, ever the psychologist, intervened before tensions could explode. He reorganized sleeping arrangements, assigned new tasks, kept minds occupied. He played games with the men, told stories, listened to their fears. His leadership style was not authoritarian but personal. He knew each man's name, his strengths, his breaking point. Outside, the ice continued its assault. The Endurance groaned continuously now, a sound that had become so constant the men almost stopped noticing. Almost, in July, the pressure intensified, the ship began to tilt. The ice was lifting the stern out of the water, twisting the hull. Worsley measured the stress on the timbers and reported to Shackleton. The ship was bending. If the pressure continued, she would break. Shackleton ordered the crew to prepare emergency supplies. They hauled sledges, tents, and provisions onto the ice beside the ship. If Endurance went down, they would need to survive on the ice itself. The nearest land was Pollard Island, 346 miles to the northwest, where a cache of supplies had been left by a previous expedition. 346 miles across, broken pack ice, pulling sledges, in sub-zero temperatures. It seemed impossible, but impossibility had become their new reality. Chapter 4. August, the breaking point. August brought no relief. The sun remained absent. The ice pressure increased. And on August 1st, 1915, exactly 1 year after they'd left London, the Endurance began to die. The men heard the sound first, a crack like a rifle shot. Then another. The hull was fracturing. Water began seeping into the hold. The pumps were started, but they couldn't keep pace. Shackleton made the decision he'd been dreading: abandon ship. Not yet, but prepare. They moved more supplies onto the ice, enough food for 90 days. 3 lifeboats, sledges, fuel, sleeping bags, scientific instruments. They worked in shifts, 24 hours a day, hauling ton after ton of equipment across the ice in complete darkness, guided by lamplight. The crew established a camp they named Ocean Camp on a stable ice floe 200 yards from the ship. They pitched tents, organized supplies, tried to create some semblance of order in the chaos, but they refused to give up on Endurance. Worsley and the carpenters worked desperately to shore up the hull, pumping water, reinforcing broken timbers. For weeks they fought. The ship settled lower. Water filled the engine room, then the crew quarters. Everything they'd lived in for a year was slowly sinking beneath them. Shackleton watched his ship die with the stoic resolve of a general watching his army retreat. He had chosen this vessel. He had led these men into this frozen hell. And now he faced the fundamental question of leadership. What next? Chapter 5. October 27th, the end of Endurance. On October 27th, 1915, the ice won. The sun had returned in September, ending the long Antarctic night, but it brought no salvation. The pressure intensified with the changing seasons. The ice floe shifted, twisted, collided with renewed violence. And on that October afternoon, the Endurance let out a sound that every man would remember until his dying day. It was not a groan. It was a scream, the scream of wood shattering, of metal tearing, of a living thing being murdered. The ship's back broke. Her hull splintered. The deck buckled upward, masts tilting at impossible angles. Men watched from Ocean Camp as their home. Their protection, their link to civilization, was crushed to splinters before their eyes. Shackleton gave the order to strip the ship of everything useful. The men climbed aboard the Liston wreck, working frantically to salvage what they could. Hurley, the photographer, went below deck into the freezing water to retrieve his photographic plates, the visual record of their expedition. He saved hundreds of glass negatives, choosing which images to keep and which to smash so he would be tempted to carry too much weight. Every pound mattered now. They salvaged lumber, nails, canvas, rope. They rescued the lifeboats, 3 small wooden boats named James Caird, Dudley Docker, and Stancomb Wills. These boats, Shackleton knew, were now their only hope. On November 21st, 1915, nearly a month after the initial break, the Endurance finally slipped beneath the ice. The men stood in silence, watching the stern rise into the air, the propeller stark against the white landscape, and then she was gone. Swallowed by the Weddell Sea, 28 men stood on a floating ice floe in the middle of the Antarctic Ocean. Thousands of miles from civilization, with no ship, no radio, and no reasonable prospect of rescue. They were utterly alone. Chapter 6. March on the ice. Shackleton gathered the crew and laid out the reality with brutal honesty. No one is coming for us. No one knows we're in trouble. Our only chance is to save ourselves. The plan was to march northwest across the ice to Pollard Island, 346 miles away, dragging the lifeboats on sledges. When they reached open water, they would sail to the island and the supply cache. From there, they could attempt to reach South Georgia Island or hope for a whaling ship. It was a desperate plan, perhaps suicidal, but it was the only plan. They started immediately. Each man was allowed to keep 2 pounds of personal belongings. Everything else was abandoned. Shackleton took out his gold cigarette case and Bible, kept a few pages of scripture, and threw the rest onto the ice. The message was clear. Nothing mattered except survival. The march was hell. The ice was not flat, but a chaotic landscape of pressure ridges, crevasses, and slush pools. The sledges carrying the boats weighed over a ton each. It took 18 men hauling on ropes to move a single sledge. They worked in rotating shifts, advancing a few hundred yards, then returning to haul the next boat forward. Progress was measured in feet per hour. Men sank to their waists in slush. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes. They hauled until their hands bled, then hauled some more. After 3 days, they had advanced 7 miles. At this rate, reaching Pollard Island would take months longer than their food would last. The ice was too broken, the loads too heavy. Shackleton made the hardest decision of his life: stop the march. They would make camp on an ice floe and drift with the current, hoping it carried them north toward open water. They would wait on the ice, conserve energy, and trust to luck. They established Patience Camp on a large, stable floe. The name was ironic. They had no patience left on the Endurance. For 4 months the men lived on the ice. They pitched tents, rationed food, and hunted seals and penguins for fresh meat. The ice floe drifted north at an agonizing pace, sometimes a mile a day, sometimes backward. They watched the ice thin beneath them. Cracks appeared. The floe they'd camped on began to break apart. On April 9th, 1916, nearly 16 months after becoming trapped there, ice floe split in the night. A crack opened directly through the camp. Men scrambled from their tents as the ice beneath them fractured. One sailor fell into the water in his sleeping bag. Shackleton, showing the reflexes that made him legendary, dove into the freezing water and pulled the man out with his bare hands. The man survived. But the message was clear. The ice could no longer hold them. At dawn, Shackleton gave the order: launch the boats. They loaded the 3 lifeboats with every man and every pound of supplies they could carry. They pushed off into the dark Antarctic Sea, leaving behind the ice that had been their prison and their home. The water was thick with ice fragments, treacherous and freezing. If they capsized, they would die in minutes. For 7 days they sailed and rowed through the most hostile waters on Earth. They were soaked constantly. There was no way to get dry. Men developed frostbite and hypothermia. They drank melted ice and ate raw seal meat. They sailed through storms, dodging icebergs in the darkness, kept alive only by Worsley's navigation and Shackleton's iron will. On April 15, 1916, they landed on Elephant Island, a desolate, mountainous rock at the edge of the Antarctic Peninsula. It was the first solid land any of them had stood on in 497 days. Men collapsed on the rocky beach, some laughing, some weeping. They had made it. They were alive. But Elephant Island was not salvation. It was uninhabited. No one ever came here. They could survive for weeks, perhaps months, but eventually they would starve. Shackleton knew this, and he knew what had to be done. He would take 1 boat, 5 men, and sail 800 miles across the most violent ocean on Earth to South Georgia Island. If they succeeded, they could bring back a rescue ship. If they failed, all 28 men would die on Elephant Island. On April 24th, Shackleton, Worsley, Crean, and 3 others climbed into the James Curder 22-foot lifeboat and sailed into the Drake Passage. What followed was one of the greatest small boat journeys in maritime history. For 17 days they battled hurricanes, 50-foot waves, and sub-zero temperatures. They navigated by sextant in brief moments when the sun broke through clouds. They bailed water constantly. They slept in shifts, wet and freezing. On May 10, 1916, they landed on the southern coast of South Georgia Island. But the whaling stations were on the northern coast, across a mountain range no one had ever traversed. Shackleton, Worsley, and Crean left the other 3 men to recover and set out on foot, climbing glaciers and mountains with nothing but a rope and an ice axe. They marched for 36 hours straight, covering 32 miles of unmapped terrain. On May 20, 1916, 3 ragged, filthy, half-frozen men stumbled into Stromness whaling station. The workers didn't recognize them as human at first. When Shackleton identified himself, the station manager wept. 4 months later, after multiple rescue attempts blocked by ice, Shackleton finally reached Elephant Island aboard a Chilean tugboat. The 22 men he'd left behind were alive. Every single man had survived. Not one soul lost. Ernest Shackleton returned to England in 1917, not to parades and honors, but to a nation consumed by war. The Great War had killed millions. His Antarctic ordeal, once front-page news, was barely mentioned. The expedition had failed, the continent was never crossed. There was no glory, no fame, no redemption. But history has a longer memory than headlines. In the decades since, the Endurance expedition has become legendary not for what was achieved, but for what was preserved. Shackleton had embarked on a journey of conquest and returned with something more valuable: 28 lives, intact against impossible odds. He never lost a man. Leadership scholars study his decisions, psychologists analyze his methods, survival experts dissect his strategies, but perhaps the true measure of Shackleton's greatness is simpler: when everything went wrong, when the ship sank and the ice closed in and death surrounded them on all sides. His men never doubted him. They followed him across the ice, across the sea, across mountains. They trusted him with their lives, and he did not betray that trust. Shackleton died of a heart attack in 1922, at age 47, aboard a ship headed back to Antarctica. He was buried on South Georgia Island, the place where his greatest journey ended. Frank Wild, his second-in-command, died in 1939. Frank Worsley served with distinction in World War I and continued sailing until his death in 1943. Tom Crean retired to Ireland and ran a pub called the South Pole Inn. He never spoke publicly about Antarctica. In 2022, over a century after she sank, the wreck of the Endurance was discovered on the floor of the Weddell Sea, nearly 2 miles down, perfectly preserved in the freezing water. Her name is still clearly visible on the stern. By endurance they conquered, not the continent, not the ice, but something far more formidable: despair, division, death itself. The ice groaned still in the Weddell Sea, pressing against itself in the endless Antarctic darkness. But the men who survived its grip proved something that transcends geography and time: that the human spirit, when led with wisdom and bound by trust, can endure anything. If you found this story of survival and leadership compelling, there are many more forgotten tales of human endurance waiting to be told. Stories of ordinary people who faced extraordinary circumstances and discovered what they were truly capable of. The past is filled with such lessons, if we have the courage to remember them.